Imagine a life where sleeping too long wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you kicked out of one of the holiest places on earth. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the cold stone halls of medieval monasteries where sleep was tightly scheduled, bells ruled your dreams, and even yawning at the wrong time could cost you everything. It may sound peaceful, but for sleepy souls like us, it was a strict, sleepless nightmare. So get cozy, dossed, and let's drift into a world where waking up late was a serious sin. If sleepy rules and forgotten rituals of the past make your eyelids heavier, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon too. Join us for nightly stories from the strangest corners of history, told softly, slowly, just for you. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You might think that being permanently tired was a modern invention, something that came with electric lights and endless scrolling through social media feeds. But if you had been a monk at Halley's Abbey in the 14th century, you would have discovered that chronic exhaustion was not only expected, it was practically a religious requirement. And if you failed to master the art of functioning on fragments of sleep stitched together like a patchwork quilt, you would have found yourself facing consequences that made modern workplace discipline seem laughably gentle. Hales Abbey in Gloucestershire was founded in 1246 by Richard, Earl of Cornwall, as a Cistercian monastery. Like all such institutions, it operated according to the rule of Saint Benedict, a document written in the 6th century that regulated every aspect of monastic life, with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker and the inflexibility of granite. The rules specified exactly when monks should sleep, exactly when they should wake, and exactly what would happen to them if they failed to comply with either instruction. The rhythm of monastic life at Halley's was dictated by what were called the canonical hours, 7 specific times throughout each day when the entire community was required to gather in the church for prayer. These were not mere suggestions or gentle reminders about spiritual duties. They were as mandatory as breathing and considerably more strictly timed. The canonical hours began with matins, also called vigils, which took place around 2 or 3 in the morning. This was followed by lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, and vespers at sunset, with compline completing the cycle before the monks retired for their truncated night's rest. If you had been a monk at Halley's, your day would have begun not with the gentle awakening of natural sunlight, but with the harsh clang of a bell reverberating through stone corridors at an hour when every instinct in your body screamed that you should still be unconscious. The abbey bell, positioned strategically to ensure that its sound penetrated every corner of the monastery complex, was your master, your alarm clock, and your judge, all rolled into one bronze monument to sleep deprivation. The sleeping arrangements themselves were designed to make oversleeping nearly impossible, though not because they were comfortable. According to Chapter 22 of St. Benedict's Rule, monks were required to sleep in separate beds arranged in a single large dormitory. Privacy was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden. A lamp burned continuously throughout the night, casting flickering shadows that danced across the rows of narrow beds and creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a hospital ward than a place of rest. The monks slept fully clothed, girded with belts or cords, ready to spring into action the moment they heard the signal for prayer. The reasoning behind this seemingly uncomfortable arrangement was both practical and spiritual. By sleeping clothed and belted, monks could respond immediately to the call for matins without the delay that would come from having to dress. The rule specifically stated that monks should always be ready to arise without delay when the signal is given. Each will hasten to arrive at the work of God before the others, yet with all dignity and decorum. But there was more to it than mere efficiency. The constant readiness, the shared space, the burning lamp, all of these elements served to remind the monks that their lives were not their own, that even in sleep they belonged to the community and to God. At Hales Abbey, this system had worked, with reasonable success for over a century. The monks had found ways to adapt to their fragmented sleep schedule, catching what rest they could between the long night office and the dawn prayers, supplementing their rest with brief periods of quiet contemplation during the day. But by the 14th century, cracks were beginning to show in this carefully ordered system. Medieval records from visitation reports, official inspections conducted by senior church officials to ensure that monasteries were maintaining proper discipline reveal a community increasingly struggling with the basic requirements of monastic life. The visiting abbots who conducted these inspections were thorough and unforgiving in their assessments. They examined every aspect of monastery life, from the quality of the chant during services to the depth of genuflection before the altar, and they paid particular attention to violations of the sleep and attendance requirements that formed the backbone of monastic discipline. What they found at Hailes was a community that had begun to bend the rules in ways that would have made St. Benedict turn in his tomb. By the mid-14th century, many of the monks at Hailes had abandoned the communal dormitory altogether. Instead of sleeping in the single large room under the watchful glow of the perpetual lamp, they had moved into individual cells scattered throughout the monastery complex. These private chambers offered something that the rule of St. Benedict had never intended monks to have: the luxury of unobserved sleep. Without the presence of their brothers and the constant light of the lamp, monks could indulge in the dangerous pleasure of sleeping through the night bell, secure in the knowledge that their absence might go unnoticed, at least temporarily. The problems this created went far beyond simple tardiness. When monks failed to appear for matins, the carefully orchestrated rhythm of communal prayer was disrupted. The antiphonal chanting, which depended on precise timing and full participation, became ragged and incomplete. The spiritual life of the community, which was built on the foundation of shared observance, began to crumble. And most seriously, from the perspective of monastic discipline, the authority of the rule itself was being undermined by daily acts of quiet rebellion. The visitors' reports from Hailes during this period paint a picture of a community in spiritual crisis, though one expressed in the most mundane terms. Monks were admonished for not kneeling deeply enough in front of the high altar. They were criticized for failure to celebrate a daily Mass in honor of the Virgin Mary. Most tellingly, they were repeatedly censored for the quality of their chant, specifically for hurrying or slurring words during the 8 daily services. These might seem like minor liturgical infractions, but they were symptoms of a deeper problem. Monks who were too tired to perform their basic duties with the precision and devotion that their calling required. But how had a system that had worked for centuries begun to break down so completely? And what did the authorities plan to do about monks who had discovered that private bedchambers offered not just comfort, but the dangerous freedom to ignore the most fundamental requirements of their religious life? The breakdown of discipline at Hailes Abbey was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader transformation in monastic life that was occurring throughout medieval Europe in the 14th century. The rigorous observance that had characterized the early centuries of monasticism was giving way to a more relaxed approach to religious life, one that emphasized comfort and individual preference over the harsh communal discipline that St. Benedict had prescribed. This shift was nowhere more evident than in the sleeping arrangements and attendance patterns that visiting abbots found when they arrived at Hailes to conduct their inspections. The The transition from communal dormitories to private cells represented more than just a change in architecture. It was a fundamental alteration in the nature of monastic life itself. When Halley's was founded in the mid-13th century, the monks had slept in the traditional communal dormitory prescribed by the rule of Saint Benedict. This arrangement served multiple purposes beyond simple space efficiency. The shared sleeping space created an atmosphere of mutual accountability, where the absence of any individual monk would be immediately noticed by his brothers. The constant presence of the lamp meant that movements during the night were visible to all, making it impossible for anyone to oversleep undetected. Most importantly, the collective rising for matins created a sense of shared purpose and spiritual unity that reinforced the communal nature of monastic life. But by the mid-14th century, this system had been abandoned at Halley's in favor of individual cells that offered monks unprecedented privacy. The reasons for this change were complex and reflected broader social and economic developments that were transforming medieval society. The increasing wealth of successful monasteries like Halley's meant that communities could afford to construct individual accommodations for their members. The Black Death, which had swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, had reduced monastic populations and left communities with surplus buildings that could be converted into private chambers. Perhaps most significantly, the spiritual intensity that had motivated the founders of these monasteries was giving way to a more comfortable and less demanding approach to religious life. The consequences of this architectural revolution were immediately apparent in the attendance records that visiting abbots meticulously documented. Without the communal pressure of the shared dormitory, monks found it increasingly easy to ignore the pre-dawn bell that summoned them to matins. The warmth and privacy of individual cells provided a level of comfort that made the cold stone floors of the church seem particularly uninviting at 3 in the morning. More dangerously, the isolation of separate bedchambers meant that a monk could oversleep without the embarrassment of having his absence immediately noticed by his brothers. The 1394 visitation report from Halley's explicitly addressed this problem. When the visiting abbot commanded that the community at Halley's were told they must not sleep in such private chambers. This was not a gentle suggestion or a minor administrative adjustment. It was a direct order intended to restore the fundamental discipline that had been lost when the monks abandoned their communal sleeping arrangements. The visitor recognized that the private cells were not merely a matter of personal comfort, but a threat to the entire structure of monastic life. However, the records make clear that such instructions were ignored. The monks at Halley's had become too accustomed to the comfort and privacy of their individual chambers to willingly return to the harsh communality of the traditional dormitory. This resistance to reform represented something unprecedented in the history of the monastery. Open defiance of explicit instructions from higher church authorities. The failure to comply with the 1394 order revealed the extent to which the authority structure that had maintained monastic discipline for centuries was beginning to crumble. The practical consequences of this breakdown were visible throughout the daily life of the monastery. The World History Encyclopedia notes that medieval monasteries maintained discipline through a system where anyone who had broken the rules was reported to the abbot. Telling on one's brothers was seen as a duty. But the dispersal of monks into private sleeping quarters made this mutual surveillance much more difficult to maintain. A monk who overslept in his private cell could potentially remain absent from matins without any of his brothers being aware of his failure to attend. The communal accountability that had been built into the traditional dormitory system was lost, and with it, one of the primary mechanisms for enforcing attendance at the canonical hours. The deterioration of attendance at matins had cascading effects on the entire spiritual life of the community. The night office was not merely one service among many, It was the foundation upon which the entire daily cycle of prayer was built. Saint Benedict had specifically structured the monastic schedule so that monks would sleep until a little past the middle of the night, and then arise with their food fully digested for the long period of prayer that would carry them through to dawn. This carefully calibrated rhythm was designed to maximize both the physical sustainability and the spiritual intensity of monastic life. When monks began skipping matins, they were not simply missing a single service. They were disrupting a cycle that had been perfected over centuries of monastic experience. The absence of even a few voices during the antiphonal chanting created noticeable gaps in the liturgy. The reduced participation meant that the complex harmonies and responses that formed the backbone of medieval church music began to break down. Most seriously, the spiritual solidarity that was created by the shared sacrifice of rising in the middle of the night for prayer was being undermined by the growing number of monks who chose the comfort of their beds over the demands of their calling. The visiting abbots who documented these problems were not concerned merely with administrative efficiency or liturgical perfection. They recognized that the breakdown of attendance at matins represented a fundamental crisis in monastic spirituality. The willingness to ignore the pre-dawn bell was a symptom of a broader loss of religious intensity that threatened the very purpose of monastic life. If monks were no longer willing to sacrifice their sleep for prayer, how could they be expected to make the more profound sacrifices that their vocation required? The situation at Halley's was further complicated by the fact that the problems with oversleeping were interconnected with other disciplinary issues that the visitors identified. Monks who were absent from matins were often the same individuals who were leaving the cloister during the allocated reading time, or who were guilty of slurring or hurrying words during the 8 daily services. The pattern suggested that the failure to maintain proper sleep discipline was both a cause and a consequence of a broader breakdown in monastic observance. But what specific measures would the authorities take to address monks who had grown so comfortable with their private chambers that they were willing to ignore direct orders to return to communal sleeping? And how would they handle the growing number of brothers who seemed to view the pre-dawn bell not as a call to prayer, but as an unwelcome interruption to be avoided whenever possible? The response to the crisis at Hales Abbey revealed both the determination of church authorities to maintain monastic discipline and the practical limitations they faced when dealing with monks who had tasted the forbidden fruit of individual comfort. The measures taken to address the problems of oversleeping and non-attendance at canonical hours would reshape not only the daily life of the monastery, but also the fundamental relationship between monastic communities and the church hierarchy that governed them. The punishments prescribed by the rule of Saint Benedict for tardiness at divine services were both specific and escalating in their severity. Chapter 43 of the rule, which dealt explicitly with what will happen if you are late, established a precise protocol for handling monks who failed to appear promptly for prayers. The system was designed to create maximum embarrassment while providing opportunities for reform, combining public humiliation with spiritual discipline in ways that modern readers might find both ingenious and harsh. For a monk who arrived late to matins, but before the Gloria of the 94th Psalm had been completed, the punishment was relatively mild. He was required to remain standing throughout the service and could not take his regular position in the choir. This might seem like a minor inconvenience, but in the precisely ordered world of medieval monasticism, where every monk had a specific place that reflected his seniority and status within the community, being forced to stand apart was a visible symbol of failure that would be noticed by every member of the community. More severe penalties awaited monks who arrived after the Gloria had been completed or who missed matins entirely. These individuals were required to stand last of all in the choir, regardless of their normal seniority, or alternatively could be assigned to a separate place set apart for the negligent, where their tardiness would be visible to the entire community. The abbot could choose to make this separation even more pronounced by creating a designated area where late-arriving monks would have to stand throughout the service, turning their punishment into a form of public theatre that reinforced the importance of punctuality for everyone present. The most serious consequences were reserved for repeated offenders or those who missed daytime canonical hours. Unlike the night offices where late monks were still permitted to join the service after completing their public penance, daytime tardiness carried the additional penalty that the offending monk should not presume to join with the choir until he hath made satisfaction. This meant that a monk who overslept and missed prime or terce might find himself excluded from all subsequent services until he had performed whatever penance the abbot deemed appropriate for his failing. At Hales Abbey, these theoretical punishments took on particular intensity because of the way they were implemented within the specific architectural and social context of the monastery. The visitation records indicate that transgressing monks were to be beaten before the assembled community at the daily meeting in the chapter house, a typical punishment for minor infringements of monastic rules. This physical punishment was not administered privately, but was conducted in full view of the entire community, transforming individual discipline into a communal spectacle that reinforced the consequences of breaking monastic rules. The chapter house at Hales, where these punishments were administered, was a large circular building, where the monks gathered each morning for the daily meeting that addressed administrative matters and disciplinary issues. The architecture of the space, with its tiered seating and central floor area, was perfectly designed for public punishment. A monk who had been caught oversleeping or missing services would be called forward to the center of the room, where his failures would be read aloud to the assembled community before the physical punishment was administered. The combination of public humiliation and corporal punishment was intended to create a memorable deterrent that would discourage other monks from similar infractions. However, the records from Hales also reveal the limitations of these traditional punishments when dealing with monks who had developed a taste for the comfort and privacy of individual cells. Despite the 1394 order requiring a return to communal dormitories, it appears that such instructions were ignored. This represented an unprecedented challenge to monastic authority. Monks who were willing to accept repeated punishments rather than give up the comfort and privacy they had come to enjoy. The persistence of this disobedience forced the authorities to develop new approaches to monastic discipline that went beyond the traditional system outlined in the Rule of Saint Benedict. Visitation records from the late 14th and early 15th centuries show an increasing emphasis on financial penalties and threats of expulsion for monks who continued to violate sleeping and attendance requirements. Individual monks could be deprived of their portions of food or wine, excluded from communal meals, or even forbidden to leave the monastery grounds for any purpose. More dramatically, the authorities began to threaten the ultimate sanction, expulsion from the monastery entirely. For a monk who had taken solemn vows and had no other means of support, being cast out of the community represented not just spiritual failure, but potential destitution. The threat of expulsion was particularly effective because it reminded monks that their comfortable private cells and relaxed approach to canonical hours existed only within the protective walls of the monastery. Outside those walls, they would find themselves in a world that had no place for former monks who had been dismissed for disciplinary reasons. The long-term consequences of the disciplinary crisis at Hales extended far beyond the immediate problems of oversleeping and missed services. The breakdown of traditional monastic discipline represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between individual monks and their communities. The comfort and privacy that had initially seemed like harmless improvements to monastic living Conditions had created expectations and habits that proved impossible to reverse through traditional means of punishment and correction. By the early 15th century, Halley's Abbey had become a very different institution from the one that had been founded in 1246. The rigid adherence to the rule of St. Benedict had given way to a more flexible approach that accommodated individual preferences and comfort. The communal solidarity that had been built on shared sacrifice and mutual accountability had been replaced by a more individualistic spirituality that emphasized personal devotion over collective observance. Most significantly, the authority of religious superiors to enforce traditional discipline had been permanently weakened by the discovery that monks were willing to endure considerable punishment rather than surrender the comforts they had come to regard as necessities. The story of oversleeping monks at Hales Abbey thus represents more than just a medieval curiosity about religious discipline. It illustrates the fundamental tension between institutional authority and individual comfort that continues to shape human communities today. The monks who chose the warmth of private beds over the cold stone floors of the church at 3 a.m. were making a choice that remains comprehensible to anyone who has ever hit the snooze button on a modern alarm clock. The difference, of course, was that their choice carried consequences that extended far beyond personal inconvenience to challenge the very foundations of the religious life they had vowed to embrace. The bell that had once united the community in prayer had become a source of division, and the sleep that should have been a brief respite from spiritual duty had become a battleground where the future of monasticism itself would be determined. If you had been standing on the hillside overlooking the monastery of Monte Cassino on any given night in the year 1348, you would have witnessed one of the most extraordinary exercises in human endurance that medieval Europe had to offer. As the cathedral bells of the surrounding towns marked the passage of midnight, you would have seen lights beginning to flicker in the windows of the great abbey, followed by the movement of dark figures making their way through stone corridors toward the central church. These were not guards responding to some emergency, nor were they pilgrims arriving at an inconvenient hour. They were the monks of Monte Cassino preparing to undertake their nightly battle against the most fundamental human need, the desire to sleep. Monte Cassino, perched on its strategic hilltop between Rome and Naples, was not just any monastery. It was the mother house of Western monasticism, the place where St. Benedict himself had written the rule that governed the lives of monks throughout Europe. Founded in 529 CE, it had survived wars, invasions, and the rise and fall of empires, maintaining an unbroken tradition of religious observance that stretched back over 8 centuries. If any monastery could be expected to maintain perfect adherence to the Benedictine rule, it would be Monte Cassino. Yet even here, in this most sacred of places, the pre-dawn bell that summoned monks to matins had become the source of a spiritual crisis that threatened to undermine everything the monastery represented. The specific challenge faced by the monks of Monte Cassino was not unique to their location, but it was intensified by the particular way that St. Benedict had structured the canonical hours for his original community. The rule specified that monks should sleep until a little past the middle of the night, before rising for the long office of matins, also called vigils. This was not a brief prayer service that could be completed in a few minutes. It was an elaborate liturgical performance that could last between 2 and 3 hours, involving the recitation of numerous psalms, readings from scripture, and complex antiphonal chanting that required the full participation of the entire community. The timing of this office was calculated with astronomical precision. Medieval monks divided the night into 12 equal hours, regardless of the season, which meant that the actual duration of these hours varied significantly throughout the year. In winter, when nights were long, the middle of the night might correspond to what we would consider 2 a.m., giving monks several hours of sleep before rising for matins. In summer, however, when nights were short, the middle of the night might fall as early as 11 more p.m., creating a schedule that required monks to rise for prayer when most of the secular world was just settling down for the evening. The physical demands of this schedule were extraordinary even by the standards of medieval monastic life. After completing the long office of matins, monks at Monte Cassino did not simply return to bed for a few more hours of rest. The rule specified that, in the time remaining after vigils, those who need to learn some of the psalter or lessons should study them. This meant that the most dedicated monks would spend the remaining hours before dawn in private prayer and study, effectively dividing their night's rest into two separate periods: a few hours of sleep before matins, and perhaps a brief rest afterward, before the daily cycle of prayer began again with lauds at sunrise. Modern sleep researchers who have studied this pattern describe it as biphasic sleep, and note that it may actually have been more natural for human beings than the unbroken 8-hour sleep cycle that we consider normal today. Medieval people, both inside and outside monasteries, commonly experienced what they called first sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. However, the monastic version of this pattern was far more demanding than anything experienced by the secular population, because it required not just wakefulness, but active participation in complex liturgical performances that demanded mental alertness and vocal precision. The monks of Monte Cassino had developed elaborate strategies for managing this demanding schedule. The dormitory was arranged so that senior monks, who were more likely to wake easily and respond quickly to the night bell, were positioned near the younger brothers who might be tempted to ignore the summons to prayer. The rule required that monks sleep fully clothed and belted, ready to rise immediately when the signal was given. A lamp burned continuously in the dormitory, providing enough light for the monks to move safely through the dark corridors without disturbing their brothers, who might have returned to sleep after matins. Most importantly, the community had developed a system of mutual accountability that made it nearly impossible for any individual monk to oversleep undetected. Chapter 22 of the rule specifically addressed this concern, noting that on arising, for the work of God they will quietly encourage each other, for the sleepy like to make excuses. This was not merely a suggestion, it was a recognition of basic human psychology and a practical method for ensuring that fatigue did not overcome religious duty. The phrase, "the sleepy like to make excuses," reveals St. Benedict's remarkably sophisticated understanding of the ways that physical discomfort could undermine spiritual discipline. He recognized that monks who were awakened in the middle of the night would naturally be disoriented, groggy, and inclined to rationalize their way back to sleep. The requirement for mutual encouragement was designed to counteract this tendency by creating peer pressure that would overcome individual weakness. A monk who might convince himself that he was too tired to attend matins would find it much more difficult to ignore the gentle but insistent encouragement of his brothers. By 1348, this system had worked successfully at Monte Cassino for over 8 centuries. The monastery had weathered invasions by Lombards, Saracens, and Normans, had survived periods of abandonment and reconstruction, and had maintained its reputation as a center of learning and spiritual discipline throughout the turbulent centuries of the early Middle Ages. Contemporary accounts praised the high state of discipline at Monte Cassino and noted that visitors from other monasteries came to study the community's methods for maintaining perfect adherence to the Benedictine rule. However, the year 1348 brought challenges to Monte Cassino that no amount of discipline or spiritual fervor could entirely overcome. This was the year that the Black Death reached Italy, bringing with it not only massive mortality but also social disruption that affected every institution in medieval society. Monasteries, with their crowded living conditions and frequent contact, with travelers and pilgrims, were particularly vulnerable to epidemic disease. Many communities lost a third or more of their members, while others were forced to abandon their monasteries entirely as surrounding populations fled or died. The impact of the plague on Monte Cassino was both immediate and long-lasting. The monastery's population, which had numbered over 100 monks during the height of the Middle Ages, was reduced to a fraction of its former size. The carefully balanced system of mutual accountability that had ensured perfect attendance at matins began to break down when there were simply not enough monks to maintain constant vigilance over each other's spiritual discipline. Most critically, the deaths of senior monks who had embodied the monastery's traditions of rigorous observance left the surviving community without the guidance and example that had maintained their extraordinary standards of religious practice. These problems created by reduced numbers were compounded by the psychological impact of living through what many contemporaries believed might be the end of the world. Monks who had devoted their lives to prayer and spiritual discipline found themselves wondering whether their sacrifices had any meaning in the face of seemingly random and inexplicable suffering. The discipline that had sustained the community through centuries of political upheaval seemed inadequate to address the spiritual crisis created by mass mortality and social collapse. It was in this context that the first recorded instances of monks at Monte Cassino failing to respond to the night bell began to appear in the monastery's internal records. These were not cases of deliberate rebellion or loss of faith, but rather instances where exhausted and demoralized monks simply could not summon the physical and spiritual energy required to leave their beds at 2 a.m. for 3 hours of prayer in a cold stone church. The sleepy had begun to make excuses that even the gentle encouragement of their brothers could not overcome. But what specific consequences would these monks face when their absence from matins was discovered? And how would a community that had maintained perfect discipline for over 8 centuries adapt to the unprecedented challenge of brothers who were simply too tired, too frightened, or too dispirited to answer the call to prayer? The discovery that monks at Monte Cassino, the very birthplace of Western monasticism, were failing to attend matins sent shockwaves through the religious hierarchy that extended far beyond the walls of the monastery itself. This was not merely a matter of local discipline or administrative inconvenience. It represented a potential crack in the foundation of Christian monasticism that could have consequences throughout the entire church. The response from both local and external authorities would reveal the complex ways that medieval institutions attempted to balance spiritual idealism with human frailty and the limitations of traditional discipline when confronted with unprecedented challenges. The first indication that the night office at Monte Cassino was being compromised came not from the monks themselves, who were naturally reluctant to report their own failures, but from visiting clergy who attended services at the monastery during their travels. Medieval monasteries served as hostels for religious travelers, and it was common for bishops, abbots from other communities, and senior church officials to attend canonical hours during their stays. These visitors, accustomed to the precise timing and full participation that characterized monastic worship at its best, immediately noticed when services began late, when responses were weak due to reduced participation, or when the complex harmonies of antiphonal chanting broke down because too few voices were present to maintain the liturgical structure. The reports these visitors carried back to Rome painted a troubling picture of decline at what should have been the most disciplined monastery in Christendom. Letters from the period describe matin services that began 15 or 20 minutes late, while the few monks who had responded to the bell waited for absent brothers who never appeared. They noted the awkward silences that occurred when antiphonal responses that required specific numbers of voices could not be performed properly. Most disturbing of all, they reported instances where the office had to be abbreviated or simplified because the reduced and demoralized community could not manage the full liturgical program that had been maintained at Monte Cassino for centuries. The abbot of Monte Cassino, faced with this crisis of discipline, initially attempted to address the problem through the traditional methods prescribed in the Rule of Saint Benedict. Chapter 43 of the Rule provided specific instructions for dealing with monks who failed to attend canonical hours promptly, and these penalties were implemented with increasing severity as the problems persisted. Monks who missed matins entirely were required to stand in designated areas during subsequent services where their failure would be visible to the entire community. They were excluded from their regular positions in the choir and forced to perform public penance before being readmitted to full participation in community life. However, the traditional system of monastic discipline had been designed for communities where infractions were occasional exceptions to generally faithful observance. The penalties outlined in the rule assumed that public humiliation and temporary exclusion would be sufficient deterrents, because most monks would prefer the comfort of conformity to the embarrassment of standing apart from their brothers. At Monte Cassino in 1348, these assumptions were proving inadequate to address a situation where significant numbers of monks were consistently failing to meet the basic requirements of monastic life. The problem was further complicated by the fact that many of the monks who were missing matins were not doing so out of deliberate disobedience or spiritual laziness, but because they were genuinely unable to function on the fragmented sleep schedule that the rule required. The psychological trauma of the plague years had left many community members suffering from what modern medical professionals would recognize as symptoms of depression and anxiety. The physical demands of maintaining the traditional monastic schedule while dealing with reduced numbers and increased responsibilities had pushed the remaining monks beyond their capacity for sustainable observance. Records from this period reveal that the abbot began to experiment with modifications to the traditional punishment system that acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances facing the community. Instead of the immediate and highly visible penalties prescribed in the rule, he instituted a system of private consultation and gradual remediation that allowed struggling monks to work toward full participation in community prayer without the shame and disruption that traditional penalties would have created. This innovative approach to monastic discipline represented a significant departure from the rigid adherence to the rule that had characterized Monte Cassino for centuries. The abbot recognized that the spiritual health of the community was more important than mechanical compliance with regulations that had been written for very different circumstances. Private meetings with struggling monks revealed the depth of the crisis facing the community. Brothers who were experiencing what they described as dryness in prayer, an inability to find the spiritual consolation that had previously sustained them through the demanding schedule of monastic life. The solutions that emerged from these consultations were both practical and spiritually sophisticated. Monks who were consistently missing matins were assigned to alternative forms of prayer and service that could be performed during daylight hours when they were more alert and emotionally stable. Some were given responsibility for the monastery's extensive library, working to preserve and copy manuscripts that might otherwise be lost during the social disruption of the plague years. Others were assigned to care for the increasing numbers of pilgrims and refugees who sought shelter at the monastery, performing corporal works of mercy that fulfilled their religious obligations while accommodating their inability to maintain the traditional schedule of canonical hours. Most significantly, the abbot began to experiment with modifications to the night office itself that acknowledged the reduced capacity of the community while maintaining the essential spiritual content of monastic prayer. Instead of the full 3-hour office prescribed in the rule, matins at Monte Cassino was shortened to focus on the most essential psalms and readings. The complex antiphonal chanting that required large numbers of participants was simplified or replaced with forms of prayer that could be performed effectively by smaller groups. These changes were implemented gradually and with careful attention to maintaining the dignity and spiritual content of the liturgy, but they represented a fundamental adaptation of Benedictine tradition to meet the realities of a community in crisis. The response from external church authorities to these innovations was mixed and reflected broader tensions within medieval Christianity about the relationship between institutional tradition and pastoral necessity. Conservative voices within the church hierarchy viewed any modification of the rule of Saint Benedict as a dangerous precedent that could undermine monastic discipline throughout Europe. They argued that if Monte Cassino, the mother house of Western monasticism, could not maintain the standards established by its founder, what hope was there for lesser communities to resist the temptation to compromise their spiritual obligations for the sake of human comfort? However, more progressive church leaders recognized that the extraordinary circumstances of the plague years required extraordinary responses. They pointed out that Saint Benedict himself had included provisions in his rule for adapting monastic practice to local conditions and extraordinary circumstances. The rule explicitly stated that if the brothers arise too late, some of the lessons or responsories should be shortened, acknowledging that even the founder of Western monasticism had anticipated situations where perfect adherence to the prescribed schedule might not be possible. The debate over the modifications at Monte Cassino continued for several years and ultimately resulted in a series of papal letters that attempted to balance the need for maintaining monastic discipline with recognition of the extraordinary challenges facing religious communities in the aftermath of the Black Death. These documents, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveal the complex process by which medieval church authorities attempted to maintain institutional continuity while adapting to unprecedented social and spiritual challenges. But the most significant test of the new approach to monastic discipline at Monte Cassino would come not from external criticism, but from within the community itself, as monks who had grown accustomed to the modified schedule began to question whether further relaxations of traditional observance might be justified. The question that would determine the future of the monastery was whether the adaptive measures introduced as temporary responses to crisis would become permanent features of monastic life, fundamentally altering the character of Western monasticism forever. The long-term consequences of the disciplinary crisis at Monte Cassino extended far beyond the immediate problems of monks oversleeping and missing matins, ultimately reshaping the fundamental character of Western monasticism in ways that would influence religious life for centuries to come. The adaptive measures that had been introduced as temporary responses to the extraordinary circumstances of the plague years gradually became permanent features of monastic practice, creating a new model of religious life that balanced traditional spiritual discipline with a more nuanced understanding of human limitations and pastoral care. By 1355, 7 years after the initial crisis, the modified schedule at Monte Cassino had evolved into a comprehensive reform of monastic practice that maintained the essential spiritual content of Benedictine life while acknowledging the realities of human nature that Saint Benedict himself had recognized when he wrote that the sleepy like to make excuses. The community had developed what modern scholars describe as a graduated system of monastic observance that allowed individual monks to participate in religious life at levels that matched their spiritual and physical capacity while maintaining the collective identity and purpose of the monastery. The centerpiece of this reformed system was a reconceptualization of the night office that preserved its spiritual significance while making it more sustainable for long-term practice. Instead of the traditional 3-hour matins that had proven too demanding for many monks during the crisis years, the community had developed 3 different versions of the night office that could be selected based on circumstances and individual capacity. The full traditional office was maintained for major feast days and special occasions when the entire community could participate with the energy and attention that the complex liturgy required. A shortened version, focusing on the most essential, psalms and readings, was used for ordinary weekdays when reduced participation or challenging weather conditions made the full office impractical. Most innovatively, a private office was established that allowed monks who were unable to attend the communal celebration to fulfill their obligation for night prayer through individual devotions in their cells. This tripartite system represented a fundamental shift in monastic thinking about the relationship between individual spiritual needs and communal religious obligation. Traditional Benedictine practice had emphasized uniformity and collective participation as essential elements of monastic life, based on the assumption that spiritual growth was best achieved through shared discipline and mutual accountability. The reforms at Monte Cassino introduced the radical idea that individual differences in temperament, health, and spiritual development might require different approaches to religious practice, even within the same community. The practical implementation of this system required sophisticated organizational skills and a level of pastoral sensitivity that challenged traditional models of monastic authority. The abbot and senior monks had to develop methods for assessing individual monks' capacity for different levels of observance without creating a hierarchy that would undermine the equality that was fundamental to Benedictine life. They established a system of regular consultation and evaluation that allowed monks to move between different levels of participation based on their changing circumstances and spiritual development, while maintaining accountability and preventing the system from becoming an excuse for spiritual laziness. Records from this period reveal the careful attention to detail that was required to make the reformed system work effectively. Monks who participated in the private office were required to report on their prayer experiences during weekly meetings with senior community members, ensuring that individual practice maintained the spiritual rigor that had always characterized monastic life. Those who attended the shortened communal office were given additional responsibilities in other areas of monastery life, such as manuscript copying or care for visitors, that would compensate for their reduced participation in formal liturgy. Most importantly, participation in the full traditional office remained the ideal toward which all community members were encouraged to strive, preventing the reforms from becoming a permanent reduction in monastic standards. The success of these innovations at Monte Cassino did not go unnoticed by other monastic communities throughout Europe that were facing similar challenges in the aftermath of the Black Death. Abbots from monasteries in France, Germany, and England began to visit Monte Cassino to study the reformed system and consider its application to their own communities. The correspondence between these religious leaders, preserved in various monastic archives, reveals a complex process of adaptation and experimentation as different communities attempted to balance traditional observance with the practical necessities of maintaining viable religious life in a changed world. However, the adoption of the Monte Cassino reforms was neither universal nor without controversy. Conservative monastic leaders argued that any relaxation of traditional discipline represented a dangerous compromise with worldly values that would ultimately undermine the prophetic witness that monasticism was supposed to provide to secular society. They pointed to other communities that had maintained traditional observance despite the challenges of the plague years, arguing that the crisis at Monte Cassino reflected a failure of spiritual leadership rather than an insurmountable practical problem. The debate over these reforms became part of a broader discussion within the medieval church about the proper response to social and cultural change. Progressive voices argued that the church's mission required adaptation to changing circumstances and a willingness to modify traditional practices when they no longer served their intended spiritual purposes. Conservative voices countered that the Church's primary responsibility was to preserve and transmit the wisdom of previous generations, even when that wisdom seemed difficult or demanding by contemporary standards. This theological and practical debate was ultimately resolved not through official church pronouncements but through the gradual adoption of modified practices by monastic communities throughout Europe. By the early 15th century, most Benedictine monasteries had implemented some version of the graduated system pioneered at Monte Cassino, creating a new norm for monastic life that balanced traditional discipline with pastoral flexibility. The rigid uniformity that had characterized medieval monasticism was replaced by a more diverse and individualized approach that maintained common spiritual goals while acknowledging the variety of ways those goals might be achieved. The transformation of monastic practice at Monte Cassino also had profound implications for the relationship between religious communities and the broader society they served. The monastery's reputation for wisdom and spiritual insight, which had made it a destination for pilgrims and scholars for centuries, was enhanced rather than diminished by its willingness to adapt traditional practices to meet contemporary challenges. Visitors to Monte Cassino in the late 14th and early 15th centuries found a community that had maintained its essential spiritual character while developing innovative approaches to religious life that seemed more accessible and human than the austere perfectionism of traditional monasticism. Perhaps most significantly, the reforms at Monte Cassino demonstrated that institutional tradition and adaptive innovation were not necessarily incompatible. The community had managed to preserve the essential elements of Benedictine spirituality: prayer, community life, service to others, and the search for God, while modifying the specific practices through which these values were expressed. This achievement provided a model for institutional adaptation that would influence not only monastic communities but also secular institutions facing the challenge of maintaining continuity while responding to changing circumstances. The monks, who had once struggled to answer the pre-dawn bell at Monte Cassino, had unknowingly participated in a transformation that would influence the development of Western religious life for centuries to come. Their very human failure to maintain superhuman standards of discipline had catalyzed innovations that made monastic life more sustainable and ultimately more faithful to the pastoral wisdom of St. Benedict himself. The sleep they had chosen over the cold stone floors of the church had not represented a victory of human weakness over spiritual discipline, but rather the beginning of a more mature understanding of how divine grace might work through human limitation to create new possibilities for religious life. If you had been walking through the Burgundian countryside in the autumn of 1394, you might have encountered a solitary figure trudging along the muddy roads that connected the great Cistercian monasteries of eastern France. This traveller would have been immediately recognizable by his white woolen habit, the distinctive garment that marked him as a member of the reformed Benedictine order that had revolutionized monastic life in the 12th century. But if you had looked more closely, you would have noticed something unusual about this monk's appearance: the absence of the rope belt that normally encircled a Cistercian's waist, and the careful way he avoided making eye contact with other travelers on the road. This was Brother Thomas of Montciel, and he was making the most shameful journey that any medieval monk could undertake: the walk from the monastery where he had failed in his religious vocation to an uncertain future, in a world that had no place for disgraced religious. Brother Thomas's story began 15 years earlier. In 1379, when he had first arrived at the Abbey of Montciel as a 15-year-old oblate, a child offered by his parents to religious life according to the ancient custom that allowed families to dedicate their sons to monastic service. Montciel Abbey was one of the daughter houses of the great Cistercian monastery of Citeaux, founded in the wave of religious reform that had swept through Europe in the 12th century. The Cistercians had established themselves as the most rigorous and demanding of all monastic orders, committed to a literal interpretation of the rule of Saint Benedict that rejected the comfortable accommodations and relaxed discipline that had crept into older Benedictine communities. The Cistercian commitment to strict observance was most evident in their approach to the canonical hours, particularly the night office of matins that had become the defining test of monastic discipline throughout medieval Europe. While other monastic communities had begun to experiment with shortened services or modified schedules, the Cistercians maintained the full traditional office with an intensity that bordered on the fanatical. Their constitutions specified that monks must maintain perpetual silence except during specific periods designated for necessary communication, creating an atmosphere of concentrated spiritual intensity that was designed to facilitate continuous prayer and contemplation. For a young monk like Thomas, the transition from the secular world to the demanding routine of Cistercian life represented a total transformation of existence. His day began at 2 a.m. with the ringing of the monastery bell that summoned the community to matins, a service that could last for 3 hours during major feast days. This was followed by a brief return to the dormitory before the bell rang, again at dawn for lauds, then prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and finally compline before the community retired for their brief night's rest. Between these services, the monks engaged in manual labor, private prayer, and the communal reading that was an essential part of Cistercian spiritual formation. The physical demands of this schedule were extraordinary, but they were intensified by the austere conditions that the Cistercians maintained as part of their commitment to apostolic poverty and spiritual discipline. The monks slept on straw mattresses in unheated dormitories, wore rough woolen habits that provided minimal protection against the cold, and followed a diet that excluded meat, fish, and most dairy products. During the winter months, when the stone buildings of the monastery retained the cold like vast refrigerators, the pre-dawn journey from the dormitory to the church for matins became a test of physical endurance that challenged even the most dedicated monks. For the first 10 years of his monastic life, Thomas had managed to meet these demands with the enthusiasm and energy of youth. The monastery records, maintained with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized Cistercian administration, show that he had been a model novice and junior monk, never missing a service, never requiring correction for infractions. Of the strict silence that governed community life and gradually taking on increased responsibilities in the monastery's complex agricultural operations. By 1389, at the age of 25, he had been appointed as one of the assistants to the cellarer, the monk responsible for managing the monastery's material resources, a position that indicated the community's confidence in his reliability and judgment. However, the monastery records also reveal subtle signs of the crisis that was developing in Thomas's religious life during the late 1380s. The brief notations that abbots made about individual monks show an increasing pattern of minor infractions and corrections, tardiness at morning prayers, instances of falling asleep during the long readings that accompanied meals, and occasional failures to maintain the perfect silence that was the hallmark of Cistercian discipline. These were not serious violations of monastic rule, but they suggested a monk who was beginning to struggle with the relentless demands of religious life. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Thomas's monastic career began in the winter of 1393, one of the coldest on record in the Burgundian region. The monastery, built in the 12th century when the Cistercian order was at the height of its expansion and confidence, had been designed to accommodate the spiritual needs of monks rather than their physical comfort. The dormitory, a vast stone hall where the entire community slept in individual beds arranged in rows, was heated only by the body warmth of its occupants and whatever heat might drift up from the rooms below. When temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks at a time, as they did during that harsh winter, the dormitory became a test of endurance that challenged even the most spiritually motivated monks. The Cistercian constitutions required that monks sleep fully clothed, ready to rise immediately when the bells summoned them to prayer. But in the extreme cold of that winter, many monks began adding extra layers of clothing or wrapping themselves in additional blankets, modifications that made it more difficult to respond quickly to the night bell. The community was aware of the problem, but the Cistercian commitment to literal interpretation of their rule made it difficult to implement the kind of adaptations that other monastic orders might have considered appropriate under extraordinary circumstances. It was during this period that Thomas experienced what the monastery records describe as his first great failure of observance. On the morning of February 15, 1394, the bell ringer who made his rounds through the dormitory to ensure that all monks had responded to the summons for matins discovered Thomas still in his bed, apparently in such deep sleep that the bell had not awakened him. This was not merely an embarrassing lapse. It was a violation of one of the most fundamental requirements of monastic life that called into question Thomas's commitment to his religious vocation. The punishment for missing matins was prescribed in detail by Cistercian constitutions that allowed no flexibility or accommodation for individual circumstances. Thomas was required to confess his failure publicly before the assembled community during the morning chapter meeting, where the day's business was conducted and disciplinary matters were addressed. He was then assigned to a position of visible shame during all subsequent services, standing apart from his brothers in a designated area where his failure would serve as a reminder to the entire community of the consequences of allowing physical comfort to override spiritual duty. But this public humiliation was only the beginning of Thomas's troubles. The Cistercian approach to monastic discipline was based on the assumption that shame and social pressure would be sufficient to prevent future infractions, but it failed to address the underlying physical and psychological factors that had contributed to his failure in the first place. The extreme cold that had made it difficult for Thomas to wake at 2 a.m. continued throughout the winter, and his anxiety about repeating his failure actually made it more difficult for him to sleep peacefully, creating a cycle of exhaustion and worry that made future infractions more rather than less likely. Within 2 weeks of his first failure, Thomas had overslept twice more, each incident requiring increasingly severe penalties according to the escalating system of punishment prescribed in the Cistercian constitutions. By the end of February, he had been removed from his position as assistant cellarer, excluded from participation in the community's communal meals, and assigned to sleep in a separate area of the dormitory where his movements could be more closely monitored by senior monks. The very measures that were intended to prevent future failures had transformed Thomas from a respected member of the community into a kind of prisoner whose every action was subject to scrutiny and whose spiritual state had become a matter of public concern. The psychological impact of this transformation was devastating for a young man who had devoted his entire adult life to achieving the spiritual perfection that Cistercian life promised. The shame of repeated public confession, the isolation from his brothers, and the constant awareness that he was being watched for signs of further failure created a level of stress that made the peaceful sleep necessary for responding to the night bell nearly impossible to achieve. Thomas found himself caught in a trap where the penalties for his failures made future failures more likely, while the rigid structure of Cistercian discipline provided no mechanism for breaking the cycle of shame and exhaustion that was destroying his religious life. But the crisis that would ultimately lead to Thomas's expulsion from the monastery was still to come, as the community struggled to balance their commitment to strict discipline with their pastoral responsibility for a brother whose failures seemed to be beyond his ability to control. The escalating cycle of failure and punishment that had begun with Thomas's first oversleeping incident in February 1394 reached its climax during the spring months, when the combination of increased daylight and warmer temperatures should have made the demanding Cistercian schedule more manageable rather than more difficult. However, the psychological damage that had been inflicted by months of public shame and social isolation had created internal obstacles to spiritual observance that proved more challenging than any external hardship Thomas had previously encountered. But alas, Cistercian understanding of monastic discipline was rooted in a theological framework that viewed individual failure as fundamentally a matter of will and spiritual commitment rather than circumstance or psychological state. Their approach to correction emphasized what they called mortification of the flesh, a systematic program of self-denial and penance that was designed to strengthen the soul by weakening the body's resistance to spiritual demands. This methodology had proven effective for countless monks over the centuries, but it was predicated on the assumption that the individual monk retained the psychological and spiritual resources necessary to respond to correction and make the changes in behavior that discipline was intended to produce. In Thomas's case, this assumption proved tragically incorrect. The monastery records from the spring of 1394 document a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior that suggested a young man whose capacity for normal monastic observance had been fundamentally compromised by the stress of repeated failure and punishment. Beyond the continued problems with oversleeping, Thomas began to exhibit other signs of spiritual and psychological distress. Talking during periods of prescribed silence, failing to maintain proper posture during prayer, and showing what the records describe as inappropriate emotional responses to routine aspects of monastic life. The most serious of these incidents occurred during the celebration of Easter, the holiest period in the Christian calendar, and a time when Cistercian communities traditionally demonstrated their spiritual discipline through particularly rigorous observance of their rule. The monastery records describe how Thomas, who should have been participating in the extended liturgical celebrations that marked the resurrection of Christ, instead was found asleep in the church during the reading of the Passion narrative, one of the most solemn moments in the entire liturgical year. This was not simply another instance of oversleeping. It was a public demonstration of spiritual indifference that scandalized the community and called into question whether Thomas retained any genuine commitment to his monastic vocation. The response to this incident revealed the limitations of traditional Cistercian discipline when confronted with a case that did not fit the standard categories of monastic correction. The abbot, an elderly monk named Dom Bernard, who had governed the community for over 20 years, initially attempted to address Thomas's behavior through the established procedures for dealing with serious infractions of monastic rule. These included extended periods of fasting, exclusion from communion, and assignment to the most menial forms of manual labor that the monastery could provide. However, instead of producing the spiritual awakening and renewed commitment that such penalties were designed to achieve, these punishments seemed only to deepen Thomas's alienation from the community and his apparent indifference to the religious life he had once embraced with enthusiasm. The situation was further complicated by the reaction of other monks in the community, who were divided between those who viewed Thomas's behavior as a spiritual crisis that required pastoral care and those who saw it as deliberate rebellion that threatened the discipline of the entire monastery. The Cistercian emphasis on communal solidarity meant that the failure of any individual monk was seen as a failure of the entire community, creating pressure for decisive action that would restore the spiritual integrity that Thomas's behavior was perceived to have compromised. The theological framework that governed Cistercian thinking about such situations provided little guidance for addressing a case where traditional disciplinary measures seemed to be counterproductive. The order's constitutions were based on the assumption that all genuine monastic vocations would respond positively to correction, and that persistent failure to improve indicated either a lack of authentic calling to religious life or deliberate resistance to God's grace. This binary understanding left no room for the possibility that a monk might retain a genuine spiritual vocation while being unable to meet the specific behavioral requirements that the order demanded for its expression. Dom Bernard's attempts to find a middle way between pastoral compassion and institutional discipline led to a series of increasingly desperate expedients that ultimately satisfied neither objective. Thomas was temporarily relieved of all regular duties and assigned to work alone in the monastery's gardens, where his failures of observance would be less visible to the community and less disruptive to their collective spiritual life. He was permitted to attend a simplified version of the canonical hours that reduced the physical and emotional demands of full participation in liturgical worship. Most significantly, he was assigned to meet regularly with the monastery's most experienced spiritual director, an elderly monk who had guided many young religious through periods of spiritual difficulty. These accommodations represented a significant departure from traditional Cistercian practice and were viewed with suspicion by many community members who feared that they established dangerous precedents for future cases of disciplinary problems. The criticism was not entirely unjustified, as records from other Cistercian monasteries suggest that word of the special treatment being afforded to Thomas had spread throughout the order and was being cited by monks in other communities who were experiencing similar difficulties with the demanding schedule of canonical hours. The fear that compassionate flexibility might undermine the entire system of monastic discipline created pressure on Dom Bernard to resolve Thomas's case in a way that would reaffirm the order's commitment to uncompromising spiritual standards. The resolution came in the form of what the records describe as the Great Sleep of August 15th, an incident that provided the justification for the decisive action that the community had been reluctant to take through the spring and summer months. August 15th was the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, one of the most important celebrations in the Cistercian calendar, and an occasion when the community's spiritual discipline was expected to be particularly exemplary. The Eid celebration began with an extended matin service at midnight that included special readings, elaborate chanting, and ceremonial elements that made it one of the most solemn and beautiful liturgical events of the entire year. Thomas's failure to appear for this service, followed by the discovery that he was sleeping so deeply in his cell that neither the bell nor the direct intervention of senior monks could wake him, was interpreted by the community as a definitive rejection of his monastic vocation. The symbolism of the incident, a monk sleeping through the celebration of the Virgin Mary's Assumption into heaven, was too powerful and too scandalous to be overlooked or minimized through further pastoral accommodations. The community saw in Thomas's behavior a spiritual deadness that no amount of correction or compassion could remedy, and his fate was sealed by his inability to respond to the most significant spiritual summons of the entire year. The process that led from this final failure to Thomas's expulsion from the monastery revealed the complex legal and spiritual procedures that governed the most serious disciplinary cases in medieval religious communities. Cistercian constitutions required that any decision to expel a professed monk be confirmed by a council of senior community members and approved by the abbot of the mother house from which the local monastery had been founded. This process was designed to prevent hasty or unjust decisions, but it also meant that Thomas's case became the subject of extended deliberation that prolonged his agony and that of the community for several additional months. The theological questions raised by Thomas's case extended beyond the immediate practical problems of maintaining monastic discipline to fundamental issues about the nature of religious vocation and the relationship between divine grace and human effort. If Thomas had genuinely been called to monastic life, as his early years of successful observance seem to indicate, how could his failure be explained except as a mysterious withdrawal of God's grace that was beyond human understanding or remedy? Alternatively, if his failures indicated that he had never possessed an authentic vocation, what did that suggest about the community's ability to discern and nurture genuine religious calling? These questions would ultimately determine not only Thomas's fate, but also the broader approach that Cistercian monasteries would take towards similar cases in the future, as communities throughout Europe watched to see how one of their most respected houses would balance the demands of institutional discipline with the pastoral care of a brother whose spiritual crisis had pushed him beyond the boundaries of traditional monastic correction. The final months of Thomas's life at Montiel Abbey unfolded with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy, as the young monk who had once been considered a model of religious observance found himself moving step by step toward an exile that would strip him not only of his monastic identity, but also of any clear place in the medieval world that lay beyond the monastery walls. The deliberations that would determine his fate revealed the complex intersection of spiritual, legal, and practical considerations that governed the most serious decisions in medieval religious life, while his own psychological state during this period illustrated the devastating personal cost of institutional conflicts between individual pastoral needs and communal disciplinary requirements. The formal process of evaluation that preceded Thomas's expulsion began in September 1394, when Dom Bernard convened a council of the monastery's senior monks to assess whether Thomas's repeated failures indicated a genuine inability to live according to Cistercian standards, or simply a lack of effort that could still be corrected through appropriate spiritual direction. The proceedings of this council, preserved in the monastery's archives, reveal the careful attention to canonical law and monastic tradition that characterized medieval religious decision-making, as well as the genuine spiritual anguish of community leaders who were attempting to balance their pastoral responsibilities with their obligation to maintain the institutional integrity of monastic life. The testimony presented during these deliberations painted a complex picture of a young man whose spiritual development had been profoundly shaped by 15 years of monastic formation, but who had apparently reached a point where he could no longer function within the specific structures that had nurtured his religious growth. Brother Marcus, the monastery's novice master, who had supervised Thomas's early training, testified that the young monk had shown exceptional promise and genuine spiritual insight during his formative years. Brother Philip, who had worked closely with Thomas in the cellarer's office, described him as conscientious and reliable in his practical duties, even during the period when his attendance at canonical hours had become irregular. However, the testimony also revealed the extent to which Thomas's behavior had deteriorated beyond the simple problem of oversleeping that had initially brought him to the community's attention. Dom Anselm, the monastery's spiritual director, who had been working with Thomas since the spring, reported that their conversations had revealed a young man who was experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. Thomas had described feelings of spiritual emptiness that made prayer seem meaningless, overwhelming fatigue that persisted even when he was able to get adequate sleep, and a growing sense that his presence in the monastery was harmful to the spiritual life of his brothers. Most troubling of all, Thomas had begun to express doubts about fundamental aspects of Christian faith that went far beyond the practical difficulties of maintaining monastic observance. He questioned whether the demanding schedule of canonical hours really served any spiritual purpose, whether the harsh physical conditions of Cistercian life were compatible with psychological health, and whether the institutional church had become so removed from the simple gospel message of Jesus Christ that it was no longer capable of providing authentic spiritual guidance. These were not merely the complaints of a tired monk looking for excuses to avoid difficult obligations. They were the theological reflections of an intelligent young man whose spiritual crisis had led him to question the entire framework within which he had understood his relationship with God. The response of the monastic council to this testimony revealed the limitations of medieval spiritual psychology when confronted with conditions that would not be adequately understood until the development of modern mental health science. The senior monks interpreted Thomas's spiritual crisis primarily through the lens of traditional ascetical theology, which viewed periods of dryness and spiritual difficulty as normal stages in religious development that could be overcome through increased prayer, penance, and submission to divine will. From this perspective, Thomas's inability to respond positively to traditional corrective measures indicated not a psychological condition that required specialized treatment, but a spiritual rebellion that required decisive action to prevent its spread to other community members. However, the Council's deliberations also revealed a growing awareness that Thomas's case presented challenges that did not fit comfortably within traditional categories of monastic correction. Several senior monks testified that they had observed similar patterns of spiritual and behavioral deterioration in other young religious, suggesting that the demanding Cistercian lifestyle might be inherently unsuitable for certain psychological temperaments, regardless of their initial spiritual motivational commitment. This recognition led to extended discussions about whether monastic communities had a responsibility to adapt their practices to accommodate individual differences, or whether the preservation of institutional standards required the exclusion of those who could not meet traditional expectations. The theological dimensions of these discussions were complicated by broader developments within late medieval Christianity that were calling into question many aspects of traditional religious life. The Great Western Schism, which had divided the Church between competing papal claimants since 1378, had undermined confidence in institutional religious authority and encouraged individual Christians to seek more personal and direct relationships with God. The emergence of mystical movements that emphasized interior spiritual experience over external religious observance had created alternatives to traditional monasticism that appealed to many individuals who found conventional religious life unsatisfying or spiritually barren. Thomas's case thus became a focal point for broader anxieties about the future of Cistercian monasticism in a rapidly changing religious landscape. The community leaders recognized that their decision would establish precedents that would influence how other monasteries dealt with similar cases, potentially affecting the order's ability to maintain the rigorous standards that had distinguished it from other forms of religious life since its foundation in the 12th century. At the same time, they were aware that overly harsh treatment of a monk, whose failures seemed to stem from genuine spiritual crisis rather than deliberate rebellion, might undermine their moral authority and discourage other young men from seeking monastic vocations. The final decision to expel Thomas from the monastery was reached in November 1394, after 2 months of deliberation that had exhausted both the community's patience and their capacity for pastoral innovation. The formal decree cited his persistent failure to maintain the observances essential to Cistercian life and his inability to profit from correction, language that placed the responsibility for his expulsion squarely on his own spiritual inadequacies, rather than on any failure of institutional support or pastoral care. However, the private letters between Dom Bernard and the abbot of Citeaux that accompanied the formal documentation revealed a more nuanced understanding of the case and a recognition that Thomas's expulsion represented a failure of the entire community to address the complex challenges of contemporary religious life. The practical arrangements for Thomas's departure from the monastery reflected both the legal requirements that governed such cases and the genuine pastoral concern that the community continued to feel for his welfare despite their inability to accommodate his spiritual needs. He was provided with secular clothing to replace the religious habit that he could no longer wear, a small sum of money to support himself during the transition to lay life, and letters of recommendation that would help him find employment or support from charitable institutions. Most importantly, he was given the option to seek admission to other religious communities that might be better equipped to address his particular spiritual and psychological needs, though the circumstances of his expulsion made such a transfer highly unlikely. The emotional impact of leaving the only adult life he had ever known was devastating for Thomas, who had no family connections to provide support and no practical skills that would enable him to earn a living in the secular world. The monastery records note that he spent his final weeks at Monastery in what appeared to be a state of profound depression, participating minimally in community life and showing little interest in the practical preparations for his departure. His brothers, who had struggled with their own feelings about his expulsion, found it difficult to offer appropriate support or comfort to someone whose presence had become a constant reminder of the fragility of their own monastic vocations. The final departure of Thomas from Montciel Abbey on December 1st, 1394, marked not only the end of his individual monastic career, but also the beginning of a broader transformation in Cistercian attitudes toward the relationship between institutional discipline and pastoral care. The image of the young monk walking alone through the winter countryside, carrying all his worldly possessions in a small bundle, became a powerful symbol within the order of the human cost of uncompromising adherence to traditional standards in a world that was becoming increasingly complex and challenging for religious life. The long-term consequences of Thomas's case extended far beyond the walls of Montciel Abbey, as news of his expulsion spread throughout the network of Cistercian monasteries that connected religious communities across medieval Europe. Other communities began to report similar cases of young monks whose inability to maintain the demanding schedule of canonical hours had led to spiritual crises that traditional forms of correction seemed unable to address. The realization that Thomas's experience was not unique forced the order's leadership to confront fundamental questions about whether their approach to monastic formation and discipline was adequate for the changing conditions of late medieval religious life. Within a generation of Thomas's expulsion, most Cistercian monasteries had implemented some form of the graduated system of observance that had been pioneered at Monte Cassino, acknowledging that individual differences in temperament and capacity required more flexible approaches to religious practice than their founders had envisioned. The young man whose inability to wake for matins had seemed to represent a failure of monastic vocation had inadvertently catalyzed reforms that would make monastic life more sustainable and humane for thousands of religious who followed in his path. The irony of Thomas's legacy was that his greatest failure had ultimately contributed to the preservation and renewal of the very institution that had been unable to accommodate his particular spiritual needs. His story became a cautionary tale that reminded future generations of monastic leaders that the pursuit of spiritual perfection must always be balanced with pastoral wisdom, and that the true test of religious community lies not in its ability to maintain abstract standards of observance, but in its capacity to nurture the authentic spiritual growth of all its members, even those who struggle to conform to conventional expectations of religious life. If you had been standing in the great Abbey Church of Cluny on the morning of October 25th, 1791, you would have witnessed one of the most poignant endings in the history of Western monasticism. As the morning light filtered through the magnificent, stained glass windows that had been crafted by medieval artisans 6 centuries earlier, 12 elderly monks gathered for what they knew would be the final Mass ever celebrated in what had once been the largest church in Christendom. The last abbot of Cluny, Dom Antoine Augustin Calmet, stood at the altar where hundreds of his predecessors had offered the Eucharist for over 700 years, his voice trembling as he spoke the familiar Latin words that had echoed through these sacred walls since the days when Cluny had been the spiritual capital of medieval Europe. The 12 monks who attended this final service represented all that remained of a community that had once numbered over 400 brothers and had governed a network of dependencies that stretched from Scotland to Spain, from Poland to Portugal. These were not young men who might rebuild what was being destroyed, They were the last survivors of an institution that had shaped the spiritual and intellectual life of Europe for centuries, but had gradually lost its battle against the changing currents of human nature and historical circumstance. Within hours of this final mass, they would be expelled and dispersed, their community officially dissolved by the revolutionary government that viewed monastic life as a relic of feudal oppression, incompatible with the principles of modern, democratic society. The destruction of Cluny Abbey represented more than just another casualty of the French Revolution's assault on traditional religious institutions. It marked the end of an experiment in human organization that had attempted to create a perfect synthesis of spiritual aspiration and practical governance, individual contemplation and collective action, otherworldly devotion and this-worldly influence. For over 7 centuries, Cluny had represented the possibility that human beings could transcend their natural limitations through the disciplined pursuit of religious perfection, that communities could maintain the most demanding standards of spiritual observance while exercising significant political and economic power in the secular world. The irony of Cluny's final collapse was that it resulted not from any sudden catastrophe or external attack, but from the gradual accumulation of small human compromises and accommodations that had slowly eroded the rigorous discipline that had made the monastery great. The same problems that had plagued individual monks throughout medieval Europe, oversleeping, missing prayers, seeking comfort over duty, had eventually infected the entire institution, transforming it from a beacon of spiritual excellence into a comfortable aristocratic club that retained the external forms of monastic life while abandoning its essential spiritual content. The story of this transformation begins not with the dramatic events of the French Revolution, but with the mundane details of daily monastic life that had been gradually modified over the centuries to accommodate human weakness rather than challenge it to transcendence. By the 18th century, the famous Cluny schedule of canonical hours that had once required monks to rise at 2 a.m. for matins had been relaxed to allow morning prayer to begin at the more civilized hour of 6 a.m. The rigorous fasting that had characterized early Cluniac spirituality had given way to comfortable meals that emphasized refinement and pleasant conversation rather than penitential discipline. Most significantly, the manual labor that had connected the monks to the practical realities of human life had been largely abandoned in favor of intellectual pursuits and administrative duties that kept the brothers in libraries and offices, rather than fields and workshops. These changes had not occurred suddenly or as the result of deliberate decisions to abandon traditional monastic values. Instead, they had evolved gradually over generations as each community of monks found reasons to make small modifications to ancient practices that seemed unnecessarily harsh or incompatible with their evolving understanding of religious life. The cold stone dormitories where medieval monks had slept communally were gradually replaced by comfortable private chambers. The simple woolen habits that had marked monastic poverty were supplemented with elegant accessories that reflected the abbey's aristocratic connections. The silence that had once characterized monastic meals was relaxed to allow educated conversation that befitted the intellectual sophistication of the community. Each of these modifications could be justified on its own terms. Private chambers provided the quiet necessary for serious study. Refined clothing reflected the dignity of religious office. Intellectual conversation enhanced the monastery's educational mission. However, the cumulative effect of these changes was to transform Cluny from a community of men who had renounced worldly comfort in pursuit of spiritual perfection into an institution that offered a particularly elegant and refined version of worldly comfort under the guise of religious devotion. The monks of 18th century Cluny were learned, cultivated, and socially sophisticated, but they were no longer recognizable as the spiritual athletes who had inspired the religious reform movements of the Middle Ages. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the community's approach to the canonical hours that had once been the central organizing principle of monastic life. The traditional Cluniac office had been famous throughout medieval Europe for its elaborate ceremonial and extended duration, with services that could last for hours and required extraordinary vocal stamina and liturgical precision from all participants. By the 18th century, these services had been shortened, simplified, and rescheduled to accommodate the more comfortable lifestyle that the monks had adopted. Morning prayer was delayed to allow adequate sleep, evening prayer was abbreviated to permit earlier retirement, and the demanding night office of matins had been virtually eliminated except on major feast days. The monastery's financial records from this period reveal the extent to which comfortable living had replaced ascetic discipline as the governing principle of Cluniac life. The community maintained extensive wine cellars, employed numerous servants, and invested heavily in luxurious furnishings and decorative arts that reflected their refined taste rather than their spiritual priorities. The abbey's income, derived from vast agricultural estates and urban properties, was used primarily to support a lifestyle that differed from that of the secular aristocracy, mainly in its bachelor status and theoretical commitment to celibacy rather than any meaningful embrace of evangelical poverty. This comfortable existence was sustained by a complex system of rationalization that allowed the monks to maintain their identity as religious while avoiding the demanding spiritual disciplines that had traditionally defined monastic life. They emphasized their role as preservers of learning and culture, pointing to their libraries and educational programs as evidence of their continued service to church and society. They stressed their liturgical responsibilities, arguing that their refined celebration of the canonical hours provided a spiritual service that was more valuable than the crude fervor of less sophisticated religious communities. Most importantly, they claimed that their social and political influence allowed them to serve God more effectively than monks who confined themselves to purely spiritual activities. However, by the middle of the 18th century, these justifications were beginning to ring hollow even within the community itself. Younger monks, influenced by the Enlightenment critique of traditional religious institutions, began to question whether their comfortable lives bore any meaningful relationship to the gospel values they claimed to represent. Older monks, who remembered more rigorous forms of religious observance from their youth, worried that the community was losing its spiritual identity and becoming indistinguishable from the secular institutions it was supposed to challenge and transform. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Cluny was building long before the political upheavals of the French Revolution provided the external pressure that would complete its collapse. The monastery was dying from within, slowly succumbing to the accumulated weight of small compromises that had gradually transformed a community of spiritual seekers into a club of comfortable gentlemen who happened to wear religious habits and recite ancient prayers as matters of form rather than conviction. But how had this transformation occurred so gradually that even the monks themselves seemed unaware of the extent to which they had abandoned the spiritual foundations of their institution? And what final events would reveal the hollowness of their claim to represent authentic religious life in the modern world? The gradual transformation of Cluny from spiritual powerhouse to comfortable aristocratic retreat did not occur in isolation, but reflected broader changes in European society and religious life that had been developing since the late Middle Ages. The 18th century monks who lived in private chambers and dined on fine wines were the inheritors of a process of accommodation and compromise that had begun centuries earlier, as successive generations of religious leaders had struggled to balance the demands of traditional monastic discipline with the practical necessities of managing vast wealth and political influence in an increasingly complex world. The roots of Cluny's spiritual decline could be traced to the very success that had made it the most powerful monastery in medieval Europe. Founded in 910 by Duke William of Aquitaine as a reformed Benedictine community, dedicated to strict observance. Of the rule of Saint Benedict, Cluny had initially distinguished itself through the extraordinary rigor of its spiritual discipline and the exceptional quality of its liturgical worship. The early Cluniac reforms had emphasized extended periods of prayer, elaborate ceremonial worship, and complete withdrawal from secular concerns, creating a form of monastic life that represented the most demanding spiritual athletics that medieval Christianity could imagine. However, the very perfection of Cluniac observance attracted the attention and patronage of the most powerful figures in medieval society, who saw in the monastery's spiritual excellence a means of securing divine favor. For their own worldly enterprises, kings, princes, and wealthy nobles competed to endow Cluny with lands, revenues, and privileges that would ensure their remembrance in the community's prayers and their participation in the spiritual merits that the monks accumulated through their religious observances. Within 2 centuries of its founding, Cluny had become one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe, controlling vast territories and exercising political influence that rivaled that of secular princes and ecclesiastical hierarchs. The management of this enormous wealth and power required administrative skills and political sophistication that were difficult to reconcile with the contemplative withdrawal that had originally characterized Cluniac spirituality. The abbots of Cluny found themselves functioning as feudal lords, diplomatic negotiators, and financial managers whose daily responsibilities left little time for the prayer and meditation that were supposed to be the central activities of monastic life. The ordinary monks, meanwhile, were increasingly divided between those who maintained traditional spiritual practices and those who were drawn into the complex administrative apparatus that was necessary to manage the monastery's far-flung empire. The first significant compromises with traditional monastic discipline occurred during the 12th and 13th centuries, as the community struggled to balance the demands of their expanding responsibilities with the requirements of the Benedictine rule. The traditional schedule of canonical hours, which required monks to interrupt their sleep for night prayer, proved particularly difficult to maintain when community leaders needed to be alert and functional for complex negotiations and administrative decisions during the day. The solution was to gradually modify the timing and duration of the offices, reducing the disruption to normal sleep patterns while maintaining the theoretical commitment to the full cycle of daily prayer. These modifications were initially presented as temporary accommodations to extraordinary circumstances, but they established precedents that would be difficult to reverse once the community had adapted to the more comfortable schedule they provided. Younger monks who entered the community during this period learned the modified practices as normal rather than exceptional, while older monks who remembered more rigorous observance found themselves increasingly isolated and outnumbered by brothers who viewed traditional discipline as unnecessarily harsh and incompatible with the monastery's evolved responsibilities. The process of gradual accommodation was accelerated by changes in the broader educational and cultural environment that affected all religious institutions during the later Middle Ages. The rise of universities and the development of scholastic theology created new expectations about the intellectual qualifications and cultural sophistication that were appropriate for religious leaders. Monks at Cluny were expected to be scholars and gentlemen as well as spiritual athletes, capable of engaging with the most advanced philosophical and theological discussions of their time while maintaining the social graces that would allow them to interact effectively with the political and intellectual elites of European society. This cultural evolution required investments in education, libraries, and living conditions that were difficult to reconcile with traditional monastic simplicity. The monks needed comfortable quarters for serious study, well-appointed reception areas for entertaining distinguished visitors, and refined dining arrangements that would reflect their cultural sophistication. Each of these improvements could be justified as necessary for the monastery's educational and diplomatic missions, but their cumulative effect was to create a lifestyle that bore little resemblance to the ascetic simplicity that had characterized early Cluniac spirituality. By the 14th century, these changes had become so extensive that visiting church officials began to express concern about whether Cluny was maintaining the authentic monastic life that justified its privileges and exemptions from ordinary ecclesiastical oversight. Reforming movements within the broader Benedictine order criticized Cluny for abandoning the fundamental principles of monastic spirituality in favor of a comfortable and worldly existence that differed from secular aristocratic life, mainly in its theoretical celibacy and formal religious obligations. Most tellingly, the question of oversleeping, which had been a serious spiritual crisis for individual monks throughout the medieval period, had been solved at Cluny not through increased discipline or spiritual effort, but through the simple expedient of eliminating the demands that made oversleeping problematic in the first place. By scheduling morning prayer at an hour when any reasonable person would naturally be awake, and by reducing the duration and complexity of the offices to levels that required minimal physical or mental exertion, the community had created a form of religious life that was essentially compatible with ordinary human comfort and convenience. This solution to the ancient problem of monastic discipline represented a fundamental philosophical shift in the understanding of what religious life was supposed to accomplish. Traditional monasticism had been based on the assumption that spiritual growth required the systematic transcendence of natural human limitations through disciplined practice and heroic effort. The monks at 18th century Cluny had implicitly rejected this assumption in favor of a more comfortable approach that viewed religious life as compatible with refined leisure and intellectual sophistication rather than demanding ascetic practice. The intellectual justifications for this transformation were provided by the Enlightenment philosophy that was reshaping European culture during this period. Many of the monks had been educated in the new philosophical approaches that emphasized reason, natural human dignity, and the compatibility of religious faith with scientific understanding and social progress. From this perspective, the harsh ascetic practices of medieval monasticism appeared to be primitive survivals from less enlightened periods of human development, incompatible with modern understanding of human psychology and social responsibility. The monastery's library during this period reflected this intellectual orientation, containing extensive collections of contemporary philosophical and scientific works alongside traditional religious texts. The monks prided themselves on their sophisticated engagement with the most advanced thinking of their time, viewing their intellectual activities as a higher form of religious service than the simple prayer and manual labor that had characterized earlier forms of monastic life. They hosted salons and scholarly discussions that attracted some of the most prominent intellectuals of 18th century France, creating a cultural environment that was more reminiscent of an elite academic institution than a traditional religious community. However, this comfortable synthesis of religious form and secular sophistication was increasingly challenged by critics both within and outside the monastery who questioned whether such a lifestyle bore any meaningful relationship to the gospel values that were supposed to define Christian religious life. The financial records from this period reveal a community that was spending enormous sums on luxury furnishings, fine wines, and elegant entertainments, while the surrounding population struggled with poverty and social inequality that the French Revolution would eventually seek to address through violent upheaval. The monastery's response to these criticisms revealed the extent to which the community had lost touch with the spiritual foundations of its existence. Rather than acknowledging the validity of concerns about their lifestyle or attempting to reform their practices, the monks of Cluny doubled down on their claims to represent authentic religious life through their intellectual and cultural activities. They argued that their sophisticated approach to religion was more appropriate for enlightened modern society than the crude enthusiasm of less educated religious movements, and they pointed to their scholarly achievements and social influence as evidence of their continued relevance and importance. This defensive posture was maintained until the very end, even as the political crisis of the French Revolution made it increasingly clear that their comfortable existence was no longer sustainable. The revolutionary government's critique of monastic institutions as parasitic survivals from the feudal past found particular resonance in the case of Cluny, whose obvious wealth and comfort made it difficult to defend against charges of social injustice and religious hypocrisy. The monastery's vast landholdings and aristocratic lifestyle provided perfect targets for revolutionary rhetoric about the need to eliminate institutions that exploited the common people while claiming to serve God. The final months before the dissolution of Cluny were marked by desperate attempts to preserve the community through accommodation to revolutionary demands. But these efforts were undermined by the monks' inability to articulate any compelling justification for their continued existence. They offered to contribute their wealth to national needs, to reform their lifestyle according to revolutionary principles, and to demonstrate their patriotic loyalty through support for the new political order. However, these proposals rang hollow because they came from an institution that had already demonstrated its willingness to abandon any principle or practice when it became inconvenient or challenging. The irony of Cluny's final collapse was that it resulted not from external persecution or political oppression, but from the logical consequences of choices that the community had been making for centuries. By gradually eliminating every aspect of monastic life that required genuine sacrifice or spiritual effort, the monks had created an institution that served no essential purpose and offered no compelling vision of human possibility that could justify its continued existence. They had solved the problem of monks oversleeping by eliminating the challenges that made sleep discipline necessary, but in doing so they had also eliminated the spiritual transformation that those challenges were designed to facilitate. The final Mass celebrated at Cluny on October 25, 1791, was thus not simply the end of a particular religious institution, but the symbolic conclusion of an experiment in spiritual compromise that had ultimately proved spiritually sterile and socially irrelevant. The 12 elderly monks who participated in this service were not martyrs dying for their faith, but the last representatives of an approach to religious life that had chosen comfort over challenge, accommodation over transformation, and, in doing so, had gradually lost both its spiritual vitality and its social justification. As the revolutionary authorities sealed the doors of the great abbey church and began the process of converting its buildings to secular uses, they were not destroying a living spiritual community, but merely providing the formal conclusion to an institution that had already died from within. The monks who walked away from Cluny on that autumn morning in 1791 carried with them not the sadness of spiritual athletes whose training had been interrupted, but the bewilderment of comfortable gentlemen whose pleasant lifestyle had been declared incompatible with the demands of a new social order. The ultimate lesson of Cluny's collapse was not that traditional religious life was impossible in the modern world, but that religious institutions which abandoned the demanding spiritual practices that justified their existence would inevitably lose both their spiritual vitality and their social relevance. The monastery that had once been famous throughout Europe for the rigor of its observance and the intensity of its spiritual life had gradually transformed itself into something that no longer served any essential human need, religious or secular. In solving the problem of monastic discipline through accommodation rather than transcendence, Cluny had eliminated not only the difficulties of religious life, but also its purpose, creating a comfortable void where there had once been a vibrant, spiritual community. The empty buildings that remained after the monks' departure stood as monuments to the futility of attempting to maintain religious identity while abandoning religious practice, institutional form, while rejecting institutional purpose, spiritual tradition while eliminating spiritual challenge. The bells that had once summoned generations of monks to prayer at inconvenient hours now hung silent, no longer needed to wake anyone to activities more demanding than a leisurely breakfast and a comfortable day of scholarly conversation. The last bell of Cluny had rung not in martyrdom but in irrelevance, marking the end of an institution that had forgotten why it existed and therefore had no compelling reason to continue existing. The 4 stories you have just encountered, spanning nearly 4 centuries of European monastic history, reveal a fundamental truth about human nature that extends far beyond the medieval monastery walls where these dramas unfolded. The struggle between the desire for comfort and the demands of transcendence, between individual accommodation and institutional discipline, between the practical necessities of daily life and the idealistic aspirations that give life meaning, represents a perpetual tension that shapes all human communities and all human lives, whether religious or secular, medieval or modern. The monks at Hales Abbey, who chose the warmth of private chambers over the communal discipline of shared dormitories, were making the same fundamental choice that confronts anyone who has ever been tempted to hit the snooze button rather than face the day's responsibilities. The brothers at Monte Cassino, who struggled to maintain their spiritual practices during times of crisis, were grappling with the same questions about the relationship between ideal standards and practical limitations that challenge every institution during periods of social upheaval. Brother Thomas's tragic journey from promise to exile illustrates the deeply personal cost of systems that demand perfection without providing adequate support for human frailty. And the gradual transformation of Cluny from spiritual powerhouse to comfortable irrelevance demonstrates the inevitable fate of institutions that lose sight of their essential purpose while maintaining their external forms. These stories remind us that the problems of discipline, commitment, and institutional purpose that seemed so pressing to medieval monks remain urgently relevant in our own time. The challenge of maintaining demanding standards while showing pastoral compassion, of balancing individual needs with collective responsibilities, of preserving essential values while adapting to changing circumstances, continues to confront families, schools, businesses, governments, and every other form of human organization. The monastery bell that once divided medieval time into periods of prayer and work has been replaced by alarm clocks, appointment calendars, and electronic notifications, but the fundamental human struggle to respond appropriately to the demands of duty and purpose remains unchanged. Perhaps most significantly, these stories suggest that the most important spiritual and institutional battles are won or lost not in moments of dramatic crisis or heroic decision, but in the accumulated weight of small daily choices that gradually shape the character of individuals and communities. The monks who overslept, who missed prayers, who chose comfort over challenge, were not making momentous theological statements or deliberate rebellions against their calling. They were simply responding to immediate physical discomfort and psychological pressure in ways that seemed reasonable at the time, but that ultimately transformed both themselves and their communities in directions they had never consciously chosen. The lesson of medieval monasticism's long struggle with human nature is not that demanding standards are impossible to maintain, but that they require constant vigilance, creative adaptation, and above all, a clear understanding of why those standards matter enough to justify the effort they require. The communities that survived and flourished were those that found ways to honor both the transformative vision that brought them into existence and the practical human realities that shaped their daily operations. The communities that failed were those that either maintained external forms while abandoning internal purpose, or those that became so rigid in their methods that they could not adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values. As you drift towards sleep, Perhaps inspired by these tales of monks who struggled with the same fundamental human challenges that continue to shape our lives today, you might reflect on the small daily choices that are gradually determining the direction of your own spiritual and practical development. The medieval monastery bells that once echoed across the European countryside have long since fallen silent, but the deeper rhythms of human growth and community life that they once marked continue to beat in every human heart that seeks something more meaningful than mere comfort, something more lasting than immediate satisfaction, something worthy of the effort it takes to get out of bed when the alarm calls us to purposes larger than ourselves.